June 4, 1943, Railroad Street. Mesilla, Texas. The train screeched to a halt beneath a velvet black sky pierced by thousands of electric stars. To the men inside, it looked like a hallucination, a city of light blazing in the middle of a sleeping prairie. Oberfeldwebel Friedrich Radke pressed his face against the glass, squinting at the impossible sight. Neon signs, illuminated farmhouses, and entire streets glowing long past midnight. 3 years of Nazi propaganda had taught him that America was collapsing, a decadent, chaotic society on the brink of ruin. Yet what stretched beyond that train window was abundance itself, inside the coach. Another man, Hans Müller of the 21st Panzer Division, scribbled into a hidden diary. "The Americans must be lying to us," he wrote. "No nation could possess such electricity, such wealth, while fighting a war on 2 fronts." Outside, the townspeople of Mexia lined the tracks, children waving flags, band music playing under floodlights. They had come to see the latest arrivals. 850 men from Rommel's Afrika Korps, now prisoners of war. But these weren't the cattle cars of Europe. These were Pullman coaches with padded seats and dining cars. The captured soldiers were stunned, even humiliated by the comfort of their own captivity. One later admitted, "We arrived as conquerors of the desert, but we felt like guests of an empire." The fall of the Desert Fox, just 3 weeks earlier, these same men had fought in the burning sands of Tunisia. The proud remnants of the Afrika Korps had been ground down to exhaustion out of fuel, out of ammunition, out of hope. General Jürgen von Arnim, Rommel's replacement, surrendered over 250 Axis troops, Germans and Italians alike. The defeat marked not only the end of the North African campaign, but the beginning of something far deeper, the psychological collapse of Nazi faith. For the first time, the myth of German superiority began to crack, not through bullets, but through observation. The journey begins. From makeshift camps in Oran, Algeria, the prisoners waited for transport to an unknown destination. They expected cruelty, starvation, revenge. Instead, they found efficiency bordering on the unreal. American officers, many fluent in German, photographed, cataloged, and inoculated thousands of POWs daily. Identity cards were typed and filed within hours. Radke later wrote, "Their organization was faster than ours had ever been. Even at the height of victory in France, we were the prisoners. Yet they treated us as patients, not animals. Then came the food, white bread, real coffee, meat twice a day." In a letter smuggled through Red Cross channels, Hans Müller confessed, "In the cages of Oran, while waiting for ships, we ate better than we had in 6 months of desert war. We thought it was propaganda. We did not realize this was their ordinary ration. To the Americans, it was routine. To the Germans, it was civilization on another planet." The ships of industry. When the prisoners finally boarded their transports, they discovered yet another shock: the Liberty ships. One guard bragged that a ship named SS Robert E. Peary had been built in 4 days, 15 hours, 29 minutes. The Germans laughed until they saw the rivet lines and smelled the fresh paint. It was true. The United States was producing 3 of these ocean-going giants per day. Each vessel carried them westward across the Atlantic, away from the ruins of the Reich and into the beating heart of the arsenal of democracy. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division kept meticulous notes during the voyage. He wrote of the ship's mess hall, "They throw away half-eaten steaks and whole loaves of bread. It is not mockery, they simply have too much. Their abundance is terrifying." Every scrap of the vessel spoke of mass production, standardized bolts, welded seams, prefabricated cabins. For men raised to believe German craftsmanship was the height of civilization, these ships were an insult and a revelation. Speed over perfection, quantity over pride, and yet it worked. The coast of revelation. When the convoy reached the Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia, the first glimpse of America tore away the last veil of illusion. An empire of cranes, warehouses, and shipyards stretched farther than the eye could see. One harbor, handling more cargo in a single day than Hamburg did in a week. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stobern, a Prussian aristocrat, stared at a cargo ship's rotating radar antenna standard equipment on an ordinary freighter. At that moment, he later wrote, I understood Germany had already lost the war. Even the dock workers embodied contradictions the Nazis had never imagined. Men of every race, women in overalls, all moving with the practiced rhythm of prosperity. Parking lots overflowed with civilian automobiles, thousands of them. In Germany, a private car was a luxury reserved for officers and party members. The Volkswagen, promised to the people, had been a fantasy. Here, it was everyday life, aboard the trains of abundance. Then came the final blow, the trains to Texas. Not boxcars, not cattle wagons, but passenger coaches with air conditioning and silverware in the dining cars. When an American sergeant apologized that the AC wasn't, for 3 days, they rolled through the American South, faces pressed to glass. Everywhere they looked, light. Factories alive at midnight, streets glowing, shops overflowing with goods. In Germany, blackout curtains and ration lines defined daily life. In America, abundance was routine. One prisoner, Obergefreiter Meyer, wrote to his father, "We passed through 100 towns that first night. Each had more electricity than all of Hamburg. I called the guard a liar. He only smiled and said, 'Wait until you see Texas.' They would, the cracks in the iron faith. For men raised under years of totalitarian propaganda, this journey was more than a change of scenery. It was the dismantling of a worldview. Every electric bulb, every passing car, every effortless smile from a civilian became evidence that everything they believed about the enemy was false. They had been told that America was decadent, weak, and racially polluted, a society of mongrels incapable of discipline or unity. But through those train windows, they saw a machine powered not by fear, but by freedom. And as those lights of Texas drew closer, so did an uncomfortable truth that they had been fighting for a lie. The waste was magnificent. One engineer later wrote, "They left lights burning in empty rooms, fans turned in buildings with no one inside. It was the carelessness of infinite resource." The train slowed. Ahead waited the gates of Camp Hearn, Texas, where the true re-education of the Third Reich would begin not through lectures, but through the overwhelming reality of a free nation's power. Part 2. The Camp of Contradictions, where ideology met running water. Dawn over Brazos Valley, Texas. Mist lifted from the low fields as trucks rolled through the entrance of Camp Hearn. Watchtowers stood at the corners like punctuation marks on a statement the prisoners had not yet learned to read. The gates shut behind them with a clank that should have sounded like defeat. Instead, many felt something stranger. Confusion. They had rehearsed the scene in their minds: barbed wire, barked orders, starvation rations, vindictive guards. They had braced for revenge. What they found was electricity humming through the barracks, flush toilets, hot showers, steam heat, and a hospital whose equipment outmatched many German civilian clinics. The camp commandant read out the rules in plain, unhurried German. The Geneva Convention would be observed. Mail could be sent and received through the Red Cross. Work details would pay modest wages. Religious services permitted. Educational courses available. Anyone caught harassing other prisoners over politics would be punished. A murmur moved across the assembled ranks, like wind through grass. Even the most hard-faced veterans glanced sideways. The rules treated them not as conquered criminals, but as soldiers. The first meal, in the mess hall, the line shuffled forward to the scent of coffee and fresh bread. A kitchen crew in white aprons ladled out eggs, potatoes, and meat. Oberstabsarzt, senior surgeon, Dr. Friedrich Bauer paused when he saw the steel counters and the walk-in refrigerators. He ran a finger along the edge of a Hobart mixer the size of a small cannon and muttered, not as a doctor, but as a stunned observer of modernity. Mass production even for kitchens. At the end of the line, the guard winked. Eat up. There's more. The trays were heavy. The food was hot. The bread was white. A former hotel cook from Munich, Otto Krebs, drew kitchen duty a week later. He learned the strangest regulation in the building. Prepare more than necessary. 10% over to ensure no man left hungry. Anything unserved was to be discarded. He carried a bin of intact rolls to the incinerator, hands shaking. We threw away in a day. He later wrote, more bread than my family had seen in a month. It was waste. Yes, but it was also a message, not taunting, systemic. America's strength was not only in how much it produced, but in the confidence with which it could afford to overproduce. Medicine without hate. The hospital doors opened to X-ray plates clipped on light boxes, sterilizers ticking softly, cabinets filled with pharmaceuticals German doctors had not seen freely since 1941. On a steel tray sat a vial labeled penicillin. The word had circulated through North Africa like a rumor from the future. A miracle drug that could turn sepsis into survival. In the Reich, it was legend. Here, it was inventory. When a corporal arrived with an infected shrapnel wound already red, already hot, the American staff moved as if reading from a well-practiced score. Culture, dosage, observation. The fever broke overnight. By morning, the corporal wanted to return to his barracks. Dr. Bauer signed the release, paused, and then quietly asked the American physician. Even for prisoners, the answer was soft and without theater. For patients, later, German medical officers were invited to observe techniques and share rounds. They were not praised. They were included. That inclusion undermined more than 1,000 pamphlets could have. It said, "We are certain enough of our victory to be generous, and certain enough of our values to apply them to enemies." The quiet war inside the fence. The barbed wire did not keep out ideas. It kept them in long enough to do their work. Within weeks, a camp newspaper began to circulate, printed on a clacking press in a corner building. News digests, short essays, even poetry. At first it sounded like wounded pride filtered through cautious type. Then the tone shifted piece by piece toward argument, examination, and debate. The Americans encouraged it, but crucially, they did not script it. They provided dictionaries, history books, and astonishingly multiple newspapers with conflicting editorials. One sergeant explained the logic in clipped German. "If we only hand you one viewpoint, you will call it propaganda. We will hand you 10 and let you fight among yourselves." In evening classes, professors in worn suits. Some refugees from Europe taught English grammar beside lectures on economics, civics, and the practical physics of everyday machines. An elderly instructor from Chicago, palms ink-smudged, diagrammed a 3-phase motor on the chalkboard, and then took the class outside to point at the real thing humming behind the laundry. The lesson landed the way thunder lands after lightning. Abstraction resolved into infrastructure. Ideas powered buildings. Buildings powered life. Work details. Windows on America. By late summer 1943, work details rolled out at first light trucks rumbling past pecan trees and clapboard houses. The men wore stenciled denim and carried field lunches that would have counted as feasts in the desert. They picked and packed on fruit farms that watered orchards with electrically driven pumps. They hauled sacks through cotton gins where belts and gears turned lint into bales at a pace no hand labor could match. They loaded pallets in canneries where conveyor lines stitched one small motion to the next, until tomatoes became soup at a rate measured in tons per hour. Regulations forbade direct war production, but the boundary was practical, not hermetic. Every task they performed liberated an American worker for a plant that built engines, trucks, or aircraft. The prisoners understood the arithmetic, and it humbled them. An economy this integrated could point its entire weight wherever it wished. On a railroad siding outside Houston, a POW work team watched a coal tower fill a locomotive tender in minutes. A lubrication pit crew swarmed the running gear like a ballet with wrenches. The train rolled out before the Germans finished their cigarettes. An engineer among them whispered, "They have mechanized time. Letters home, letters back." Red Cross mail routes stitched the fence to the world. Letters from Germany arrived stained with Grief City's ash, families displaced, ration coupons clipped thin as moth wings. The men read by electric light in bunks that did not shake with air raid sirens. Those who replied described the camp cautiously. They said they were safe. They said they were fed. Only rarely did they risk the truth that would have sounded like sacrilege. "We are being treated better here than many at home." When news of Italy's surrender reached the barracks in September, the shock was double. Italian POWs who joined service units received more pay, more freedom, sometimes civilian outings with escorts. The Germans watched their erstwhile allies eat in American diners, not spat upon, not beaten, but greeted with ordinary indifference. It wasn't favoritism, it was policy. Choice brought consequences. Cooperation brought privilege. In the logic of dictatorship, mercy is weakness. In the logic, the prisoners were slowly learning. Mercy was capacity. Numbers that spoke louder than slogans. Newsreels flickered in the camp theater convoys like floating cities. Willow Run belching out a B-24 bomber in a little over an hour. Shipyards spraying sparks where hulls took shape in weeks instead of months. The camera panned across women at welding torches. Black crane operators steering cargo with fingertip precision. Teenagers in coveralls threading wire harnesses. The Reich claimed such mixtures were chaos. The projector insisted they were power. Between reels, the men did their own accounting. They had seen Liberty ships. Now the screen said there would be thousands of them. They had worked a day at a fruit packer. Now the reel showed entire valleys of agriculture feeding assembly lines that fed armies that fed victory. The arithmetic of feeling counted too. After the show, the chaplain of a local church shook hands at the exit and invited anyone to a Christmas hymn service in German. Some laughed bitterly. Some didn't sleep. The moment the wires went slack, not everyone changed. There were barracks that clung to the old rage, and there were fists in the night for men who spoke too openly. But somewhere between a hot shower and a hospital bed, between a full stomach and a calculus problem explained by a refugee professor who refused to hate them, the held breath of ideology began to leak out. A young lieutenant confessed it first, quietly, to a friend while sweeping a warehouse after shift. If this, he gestured at the lights, the humming motors, the ordinary ease of the workers, if this is decadence, then perhaps we misunderstood the word. Camp life settled into its rhythm. Réveil, work, study, mail call, lights out. Yet routine did not dull the impact. It deepened it. The miracle was not spectacle, but consistency. Hot water every morning, bread every noon, rules every night. Enforced not by fear, but by the expectation that tomorrow would look like today. In a world raised on emergency, predictability itself was a revelation. And beyond the fence, trains kept rolling, ships kept launching, and factories kept glowing after midnight. The prisoners were beginning to grasp a hard truth. Wars are not only won where bullets fly, they are also won where faucets turn, where switches click, where schedules hold. The arsenal of democracy was not merely bigger. It was simpler to use because millions understood how to use it. What remained was the deepest test of all, a holiday that would measure not production, but character. Part 3, The Christmas That Broke the Spell. December 1943, Camp Hearn, Texas. A chill wind swept through the pines, carrying the scent of roasted turkey and pine sap. The prisoners watched as local trucks rolled in under the guard tower's deliveries of gifts, cakes, and parcels from the nearby townsfolk. Inside the barracks, a rumor spread faster than the mail. The Americans are giving Christmas presents to us. No one believed it. Then the doors opened. A feast for the enemy. That night, long tables filled the mess hall. Each was laid with white cloth, paper candles, and trays heavy with turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, and pumpkin pie. The prisoners' men, who had once marched through Alexandria and Tobruk, stood motionless, hats in hand. The American chaplain spoke first, in slow German. Tonight, we celebrate peace even in war. You are our enemies, but also our fellow men. The prisoners sat down, hesitant. Then they began to eat. Then they kept eating. By the time the pies came out, many were in tears. Feldwebel Hans Auer, who had survived 6 months of desert starvation, later wrote, "We ate until we were sick, not out of greed, out of disbelief. We were fed better than our generals. If this was the food they gave their prisoners, what must their own soldiers eat?" The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The food was plentiful, the gesture effortless, and the message unmistakable. A democracy strong enough to feed its enemies without fear. The choir in the barbed wire. Days later, an unexpected sound echoed through the camp. Carols. The local Methodist church choir had come to perform in German. The guards opened the gates just enough for the singers to stand outside the wire. Snowflakes drifted down as their voices carried across the compound. Stille Nacht. Heilige Nacht. Inside. Hundreds of captured men, Many who had bombed British ships or manned panzer divisions stood silent, their faces turned upward. For the first time, the barbed wire didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a border between two worlds, one ruled by fear, another by compassion. When the final verse faded, no one clapped, no one dared. One of the men whispered, "Only a nation certain of its victory could afford such kindness." The quiet revolution of minds. By early 1944, a term began appearing in U.S. intelligence reports, ideological collapse syndrome. At first, it sounded clinical, a psychological observation, but in reality, it was the quiet revolution happening inside hundreds of camps across America. German prisoners who had once sworn loyalty to Hitler began requesting English dictionaries, American newspapers, and even civics textbooks. They debated democracy, free markets, and equality ideas forbidden back home. Camp newsletters reflected the shift. At first, they printed nationalist poetry and coded messages of defiance. By spring, the tone had changed. One paper published an editorial titled, "Strength Without Cruelty: What We Misunderstood About Our Enemy." Letters intercepted by American censors told the same story. "We were told America was weak." One wrote, "But I see now, their power comes from freedom, not control. They fight with machines." Yes, but also with principles. Major Paul Noland, an intelligence officer monitoring camp morale, summarized it best in his December 1943 report. "They have seen too much. The propaganda has crumbled under the weight of reality, learning to think again." By 1944, over 40,000 prisoners had enrolled in U.S. sponsored education programs. They studied mathematics, agriculture, mechanics, and even constitutional law. Professors from the University of Chicago and Stanford volunteered to teach some of them Jewish refugees from Germany. Imagine the irony. Men who had fought for the regime that exiled these scholars now sat at their feet. Learning from them, Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, a physicist from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, recalled in his memoirs, "They taught us atomic physics without hate." These men had lost everything to Germany, yet they lectured as if science belonged to all mankind. That generosity was more disarming than any weapon. The re-education program wasn't propaganda. It was exposure. No slogans, no forced conversions, just daily contact with a functioning democracy that made its case through normalcy. A movie, a mirror. That same winter, the camp theater screened an American film, Gone with the Wind. Many prisoners expected patriotic triumph instead. They saw loss, failure, and redemption. They watched Americans criticize their own past, expose injustice, and still stand proud. One lieutenant murmured afterward, "In Germany, this film would mean prison. Here, it means honesty." Another screening followed. The Grapes of Wrath. Its portrayal of poor farmers suffering in the Dust Bowl stunned them. To show weakness, to admit failure and call it art, was unthinkable in Nazi Germany. For the prisoners, it became proof that truth itself was strength. "They hide nothing," wrote Lieutenant Josef Kramer. "They show their flaws and rise anyway. We were told freedom breeds chaos, but chaos, I see now, breeds progress, work, learning, and liberation." As 1944 unfolded, America's war machine reached full roar. Every factory, farm, and shipyard was a cathedral of efficiency, and in the shadows of that machine, German POWs were helping it run. They worked in mills, lumber yards, and canneries not under whip or rifle, but under contract. Their wages were credited to accounts. Their meals matched those of U.S. soldiers. They labored beside civilians who often shared lunches or cigarettes. One foreman from Iowa, when asked if he minded working next to a German, shrugged. "He's a man. He's hungry. So was I in 32. That casual humanity cracked the last layer of indoctrination. The prisoners began to see what their captors had known all along, that democracy was not chaos, but collaboration. The engine ran not on fear, but on trust. Christmas, the turning point. When the next Christmas came in 1944, the guards didn't need to organize anything. The prisoners did it themselves. They built a Christmas tree from scrap lumber and wire. They sang carols not in defiance, but in gratitude. They made wooden toys for local children and handed them over the fence. What had begun as disbelief had turned into understanding, and for some, even admiration. Oberleutnant Walter Müller, whose brother had died in the Hamburg bombings, wrote, "They fight a terrible war, yet still find time to show compassion. That is power, not the kind we were taught, the kind that endures." The truth becomes unbearable. Then came April 1945. The camp loudspeakers crackled with newsreels from Europe. Liberation of concentration camps. At first, the prisoners refused to believe the images: piles of bodies, skeletal survivors, the horror of their own nation laid bare. But the footage was undeniable. Letters from home confirmed it. The veil was torn for good. "We thought we were the civilized ones," wrote a sergeant named Otto Schultz. "Now we see we were the barbarians." The silence that fell over the camp that spring was heavier than any chain. The men who had arrived as believers in the Reich were now witnesses to its crimes and students of the system that would one day replace it. They didn't know it yet, but many of them would carry those lessons home to rebuild a nation that had to learn, as they did, that strength is not measured in fear, but in freedom. Part 4, From Captivity to Enlightenment. The Seeds of a New Germany. Spring 1945. The war was ending, but another beginning was quietly forming behind barbed wire. In the American heartland, across 45 states, more than 370,000 German prisoners lived inside a paradox. They were enemies in name, but students in practice, learning the very system they had been raised to destroy. The guns in Europe were still thundering, yet within these camps, a different kind of victory was being forged. Factories of freedom. As America's wartime industry reached its crescendo, prisoners found themselves working amid the vast machinery of production that fed the Allied advance. At the Higgins Boat Factory in New Orleans, they unloaded steel plates that would become landing craft for D-Day. They watched women in welding masks move like dancers under blue flame, sparks cascading like fireflies. Each of those women was producing what Germany could not: speed, scale, and unity. They built 700 boats a month, remembered Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann. In Germany, such work would take an entire navy yard. Here, teenagers and women did it in shifts, 24 hours a day. They turned raw steel into an army that floated. At Republic Steel in Ohio, others saw furnaces that never cooled, trains unloading coal and iron day and night. A former Krupp worker stared at the endless pour of molten metal and whispered, "They waste more steel in a day than we could make in a week." The truth was undeniable. America's power wasn't luck or decadence. It was organization born of democracy. Every man and woman believed they were part of something vast and moral. That belief, not fear, kept the wheels turning. The harvest of humility. By the summer of 1944, as Allied troops stormed Normandy, POWs across Kansas, Nebraska, and Texas were harvesting wheat, corn, and cotton. They expected scarcity. Instead, they found oceans of plenty. Single farms produced more grain than entire German provinces. Combines rolled like armored ships across fields of gold, cutting 100 acres a day. One farmer told his German workers, "This tractor's older than you, son, but she'll still outwork 100 men." He laughed, and the German didn't. He realized it was true. Gefreiter Franz Weber, a farmer from Bavaria, recorded, "An American farmer with 2 machines and a teenage boy harvests what our entire village could not in a year. He eats meat for breakfast and complains about the price of gasoline. They have turned nature itself into a factory." For soldiers raised under scarcity and propaganda, this was revelation through agriculture, proof that prosperity was not myth, but method. They saw a society that could waste oranges and still feed the world. One man wrote bitterly, "They destroy food to stabilize prices. We destroy men to stabilize fear." The invisible curriculum. The most effective re-education was not in classrooms, but in the ordinary decency of daily life. A guard who shared a cigarette. A foreman who lent a jacket on a cold morning. A farmer who insisted, "You're my worker, not my prisoner." Such small gestures cut deeper than ideology ever could. When Sergeant Hans Müller received a Red Cross telegram that his son had died in the Hamburg bombing, The American camp commander personally delivered it. He didn't salute, didn't lecture, he simply said, "I'm sorry for your loss." Müller later wrote, "That moment destroyed the last of my hate. The man whose army killed my son spoke to me like a father, not a victor. I realized then who had truly won this war. Even the structure of justice was alien and humbling. When a German prisoner struck another over a political argument, the guards arrested both, but gave them a hearing, a translator, and a chance to speak. Punishment followed law, not whim. That was something few Germans had ever seen. The mind reforged. By early 1945, the American Special Projects Division, the secret re-education program for POWs, noted something remarkable. The camps were teaching themselves. Inmates organized lectures on democratic theory, economic recovery, and even architecture. At Camp Kearney, Rhode Island, a group of former engineers sketched designs for modular housing that could rebuild German cities faster after the war. At Camp Shelby, a physics class debated whether atomic energy could one day power cities instead of destroy them. Arnold Kramer, one of the supervising educators, later said, "We didn't defeat Nazism with pamphlets. We defeated it with plumbing, with electricity, with dignity. Every functioning toilet and every fair rulebook was a lesson in civilization. This was America's quiet weapon, the proof of concept that freedom worked, not as an idea, but as a system that ran on predictability and participation." The Great Return. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, over 371 German prisoners had lived under this quiet schooling. Repatriation began that autumn, slow, orderly, almost tender. Before boarding ships, the prisoners received vocational certificates in carpentry, agriculture, mechanics. Some were given pamphlets explaining the Marshall Plan months before it was public. They were not told to repent. They were told to rebuild. Friedrich von Toben, an officer once captured in Tunisia, wrote as he departed, "We came here to learn how to fight. We left knowing how to live." Back in the ruins of Germany, these men became carriers of a virus not of disease, but of democracy. They rebuilt farms with American methods, organized businesses with American efficiency, and spoke quietly of a nation where the lights never went out. Historians would later call it the most successful re-education campaign in modern history, not by coercion, but by example. Legacy of the captives. In the decades that followed, the influence of those POWs spread like roots beneath the soil of West Germany's recovery. Hans Kroll, once held at Camp Shelby, became West Germany's ambassador to the United States. Walter Hallstein, who had taught civics in camp classrooms, became the first president of the European Commission. Others became engineers, mayors, teachers, men who had seen the engine of democracy and wanted to rebuild it at home. They had come to America as enemies. They left as witnesses. Their transformation became the moral foundation of the German economic miracle of the 1950s, proof that even the defeated could rise again if given dignity instead of despair. We learned, Kroll later wrote, that prosperity is born of freedom, not conquest. That the true strength of a nation lies not in fear, but in faith in its people. A reunion of redemption. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the war's end, hundreds of former POWs returned to Texas. They stood once again in the sun-baked fields of Hearne, older now, slower, but still haunted by the memories of that first night of electric lights. They sang Stille Nacht in English and German, and at the closing banquet, a former lieutenant named Hermann Gutz, once a fanatical Nazi, took the podium. His voice trembled. "We came as conquerors. We left as students. You defeated us not with hatred, but with example. You showed us that the power of a free people is greater than the might of any empire. From your fields and factories, we learned how to build our future. To America from your former enemies. Now your friends thank you for showing us the way." The audience, Americans and Germans alike, rose in a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Enemies no longer, just men bound by a shared memory of light. Epilogue. The Arsenal of Humanity. The story of the German POWs in America is not merely a tale of captivity. It is a study in how civilization triumphs not by destruction, but by demonstration. Every factory, every full meal, every fair law served as an argument louder than any propaganda. These men had been conquered by tanks and guns. Yes, but transformed by what came after. The steady, undeniable evidence of a society that worked. When they returned home, they carried the spark of that truth, and it ignited a new Germany. One founded not on myth or might, but on freedom and dignity. That was America's quiet victory. A war won not just on battlefields, but in the hearts of those it captured. Sometimes, the most powerful weapon isn't the bomb or the bullet. It's the light that stays on when the rest of the world goes dark. If you believe history's greatest battles are not only fought with weapons, but with ideas, subscribe to War Chronicles, where the past still speaks.